Hey everybody, welcome back to a new episode of DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it quite yet. I'm here with Alex, my co host, who is wonderful, creating content on Vue and Nuxt, on the core team of Nuxt, going to conferences, doing all sorts of amazing things in the community. Glad to have you back.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't join last episode, unfortunately. Been around the conference in Prague, which was pretty fun, amazing. Slides are also online that. And yeah, happy to be back. And of course, I am here with my wonderful co-host, Michael Thiessen. He's a YouTube, also streaming, but mainly focusing on blog posts, on courses, on lots of material around the Vue ecosystem, the Nuxt ecosystem. You've seen him maybe also in the Mastering Nuxt course and so on. So an amazing content creator as well. And I'm happy to talk to you again once again. How are things?
Yeah, things are pretty good. I'm excited for this episode. We're going to talk a lot about performance and Vue and talking about this latest benchmark that came out and what it means and all sorts of stuff like that. So I think there's a bunch of interesting actionable things in this one.
100%. I mean, performance is always like a big topic. I feel like, as you mentioned, there are benchmarks saying, oh, which framework is the fastest? And of course, if we just dumb it even down further, it's like, okay, we build applications. We want them to be snappy. We don't want the users to wait necessarily. And yeah, performance is such a big topic. Like we could probably do 5 podcast episodes about it. And if you are there wanted, let us please let us know. But today we want to focus on more of the Vue specific things. So we don't want to turn the whole wheel of performance of like, okay, how to test your application, what are some metrics, and so on and so on. But we want to more focus on what can Vue do for performance, and of course what it does already. We talked about in the Vue 3.5 episode about performance improvements where you don't have to do anything, and now it's more about like what you can do to make sure your application is still performant.
And the great thing about Vue and like maybe most of my development experience is that I don't really think about performance a lot of the time. But then there are cases where, as your app gets bigger or all of a sudden you are switching to lots of data and then you do realize, oh, this part is maybe not as snappy as it could be, or you get like this huge nasty performance thing. In the last episode with Eric, we talked about how they at AWS Amplify had this like weird re-rendering thing that they had to deal with. And so then it's like, when it's an issue, it's a big issue because no one wants to wait 3 seconds for something to happen after you click a button.
For sure. But I think that's also a really good part to start with, maybe like, as you said, performance or like optimizing, let's say, quote unquote, is not something you should necessarily start with, right? Like it's more, okay, you notice there are some things that are slow, and then, yeah, you should benchmark it. You should track it. You see like, okay, what is exactly slow? What's the slow part here? And optimize that code. Because by default, I think like you can also write everything super fast, and it could be like 10 milliseconds faster if you write a for loop, like a for let I equals 0, and so like not a for off, or and so on and so on. You can do that, but then, well, it will hurt the code readability and the maintainability. So instead of saying like, okay, we write all code the most like less abstract way and the most performant way, no, why not just writing the code the way it's the easiest, like readable, understandable, descriptive, and if there are hot parts that are important for performance, if you know like, okay, I have to show 10,000 records here, well, then of course this should be optimized, but not prematurely, but with, as said before, with benchmarking, with actually showing what makes the code slow to fix that.
Yeah. So why don't we jump into some of the ways we can actually, address these performance things with our apps? And one of the first things is to do with props. So in Vue, as in most frameworks, when the data changes, the DOM changes, and we trigger that re-render. So the most important and fundamental thing we can do for performance is just preventing our props and our data from changing unnecessarily. And that may sound like super obvious, but there are cases where the way that you calculate a prop or dynamically doing different things on those props, you're changing it multiple times when it doesn't actually affect the functionality. Maybe that's a little confusing. Maybe you want to take it from there.
Yeah, no, I think I think it makes kind of sense. Let's maybe have a more illustrative example. Let's say you have a list of items, and you say the first and the last one, they should be colored red for some reason because that's the requirement, or like they should be in a fancy way of showing like, hey, it's the first item, definitely buy that whatsoever. So if you have your component with, let's say, your item in there in the list, then you have lots of options, right? You can say you pass in the index of it. So like, okay, so the position, like the first position, the second, and so on, so on. Or you could say, I pass in whether that should be highlighted or not, like just with a Boolean, right? So the thing is, if you pass in a Boolean, then it only changes when it's actually needed to highlight, right? So if, let's say, you resort the list, or you remove something, or you add something to the list, then it will be on the first spot, okay, highlighted second, not anymore, third, fifth, sixth. It's fine. It's always false to be not highlighted or not highlighted. But if you pass in the position, then, well, if you don't need it for anything else, but just for exactly the functionality, there will be an unnecessary re-rendering, recomputing because, okay, you pass on different prop, things run again because a prop changes, and then it's simply more effort. So this whole concept of prop stability is super important to think about. What kind of information do I want to pass in there? Is it really the position needed because you maybe want to show it? That's fine. Or is it more about a Boolean and then compute that beforehand and give a Boolean expression in to make sure, okay, all the props are the same. Even if I move it around, I don't have to touch it. It's faster.
It's interesting too, because I think this touches on like encapsulation and like what should each component do, because if you pass in, for example, the position of each item as well as the length of the whole list, so then the child component is responsible for calculating, okay, am I in the first position or the last position? What should I do? Then, yeah, you end up with this like every single time the list changes, every single item, every single subcomponent there is going to need to do a re-render. But also, if you look at it from a, best practices, just from the code side of things, you'd say, well, why does that child component need to know all that kind of stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so this one is almost like if you're writing code in a thoughtful way and refactoring and cleaning things up as you need to, then there's a good chance you'll sidestep a lot of these problems. But it is still good to think about and to know that this is a trap that you can end up getting caught in.
Yeah, like as you said, if you always think about, okay, what does that component actually need to know, and also not be lazy about it and say like, okay, I just pass in everything and they will pick whatever they need, then yeah, you can avoid it. But I think on the other hand, it can be really tricky if you have lots of properties, if it's like a big component. Of course, as you said, refactoring architectural decisions, but as we all know it, okay, features have to be shipped here and there. Sometimes like, okay, let's go. And then wondering like, oh, if I resort the list, then maybe it will take ages to compute or whatsoever. Then that might be a good chance. And also, I mean, there is in the Vue dev tools, for example, a performance tab, so that's also worth checking out to see how long components take for rendering, for changing. So that's also one good way to check out what could be the culprit there.
Yeah, and beyond just making sure that our props are stable in this way, we've got a bunch of directives that we can use to help us with these performance things. So the first one is the v-once directive, and that one is pretty straightforward. So what it's doing is basically we're going to make it sort of like a read-only kind of thing. We're going to render that out, but only once. And after we've rendered that HTML to the DOM, we're not going to worry about any future updates. If the data in there changes, the HTML will not change. So it's sort of like we're not rendering static HTML and we're not fully dynamic. On the first load, we're going to interpolate all those variables, get them in there. But then once that's done, we won't touch that anymore. For certain situations, that's useful and we can, improve the performance there.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Like it will be just treated as static content, so to say. And in a way, like this has been around for a while. And I feel like there, at least to me, I didn't come across that many use cases where it's like, okay, I have to use that v-once directive ever. Of course, if you render like thousands of components and it's like, okay, it's enough to render it once and we're fine. And then if the component is unmounted or destroyed and will be spun up again, then I can re-render. That's totally valid use case. And yeah, have you come across any v-once usage so far in your applications?
I haven't really. There aren't a lot of situations where I found that I would need this for. And I struggle to even come up with like a particular use case, just like off the top of my head right now, but I'm sure that there are definitely use cases for this.
Yeah, I think like really of like otherwise that would be checked and re-rendered with like a lot of components inside, even though, okay, you just want to render them once and then they do their thing and it's fine. But I think that also underlines once again that like in general performance in terms of Vue.js itself and like make that more performant is rarely a case to, let's say, bother with. Maybe the whole topic of data visualization, so like lots of different nodes at once, is also something that comes up there, where it's I think more important than like in a typical CRUD application or like typical software as a
Yeah.
service thing. So like probably also like charts and all that. But maybe that also fits in very well with the next directive, which more or less is v-once but with conditions, and it's called v-memo for memoization. So the idea is that, okay, we have memoization also in normal programming. Like you can write a function that will render a result for the first time and then memoizes it. So just like saves it. And the next time the function will call the same parameters, it will just give the same result without the calculations. And that's also about the v-memo directive, but it applies to a certain part of the rendering. So you can just smash v-memo on something, and then you can define conditions as in just an expression. Can be an array of things, can be a certain variable. Let's say as long as they stay the same, please render exactly as it is. And if it changes, then re-render. So like v-once with conditions.
Yeah, and I like to think of this one as like a computed ref, but for your template. So it does like the same kind of thing of memoization, and you can specify what those dependencies are explicitly. And like one key thing with this one goes back to the prop stability thing, where we want to make sure that what we put into that dependencies aren't going to change unnecessarily, because if the dependencies change, it will re-render it. And so the same thing with those props, we want to make sure that we're only changing it when it's actually necessary to change it.
Exactly. And one typical use case with v-memo is like a v-for directive. You can use it on the same element and say like, hey, this is the list. Don't re-render it as long as, let's say, the selected element is the same. If that changes, please re-render the list so you don't have any unnecessary re-renders.
Mm-hmm.
So also there, it was introduced in 3.2. It was not part of the original 3.0 release, mainly because there was no like super huge need for it. And there were, of course, other topics to consider first, like flashing out a composition API, script setup, and so on, so on. But it's nice that it's there and that you also have a choice between saying, okay, I render it once and that's it, or like I render it every time, just have a little fine-grained control. And there, v-memo is extremely useful.
Yeah, I also want to mention that there's this other directive, v-pre, which is basically telling the compiler to just like ignore everything. And I don't know if I've ever found a good use case for this. I'm not sure what the intended use case is, but it's basically like it won't interpolate it, it won't compile it. It kind of acts like a pre tag where it just preserves all of the formatting and everything in there.
Yeah, for like v-preserve, I suppose. So that makes sense. I think like main use cases is if you don't use Vue standalone, but have something like a rendering engine that renders other content inside there, uses also like the
Yeah.
mustache syntax, or maybe also with web components that you want to render, or like any kind of other components in there that should be like, okay, this should not be interpreted as a Vue component. Everything that goes in there should be like a different kind of component. But that's mainly for interoperability, I would say.
Yeah, now that I say it out loud, I think it's not as much about performance, but for some reason I always had it in my head that it was like a performance thing. So
I mean, I probably won't do a big thing in there, but if you use Vue with other systems, then of course the v pre tag is super necessary. So that's never a bad idea to mention. And yeah, I mean, from there we've talked a lot about prop stability, about memoization and rendering things once or based on conditions. You also mentioned that v-memo is a bit like a computer, but for the template, let's say. But let's talk about computers themselves, because in general reactivity, we talked about it in an episode before. It's super useful. It's baked in. We don't have to think about it much after understanding the concepts. But in terms of performance, there can be quite a few things done there. Because especially if you have a computed and it returns an object, then you might run into issues because let's say your computer returns a string or a Boolean and it's all fine because obviously you can just compare them with a triple equals and say, okay, the strings are the same or not. With objects and arrays, as everyone in here knows, like we can't compare them with triple equals because even if you have the same content, well, then there's still a new reference. So they're technically same content, but different objects. Not this, they don't point to the same position in memory, so to say. So that means you might accidentally trigger some re-renderings by just returning a new object and compute it every time, and then using the results of that object. So if you say, like, I don't know, you have an object and return a couple options there because you want to pass them in a component or a couple classes, that can be really useful. But the problem is there then that if you pass the computed as is, well, then you might trigger re-renders in your components or like your logs, watchers, whatsoever, just because it is always a new instance.
Would this, I'm wondering, like, if you took that computed that calculates this new object, if you split it into a bunch of computed refs that each calculate individual values, like your primitive values, like string, number, whatever, and then you had a final computed that combines it all at the end, if that would be a way to sort of prevent that. So like if any of the underlying values changes, the decomposed computed refs are being memoized properly and you're sort of splitting that out.
But as long as there is a new object created in the end, then you always have the same problem, right? Like let's say you only need one information in there and the object will be always recreated, so it will always be checked. So either just take the three computed separately, or
Right.
if the performance is not important there, then it's fine. Like once again, it's not an anti-pattern. It's not like people say, oh, let's never do that. It's more, let's say you watch that computed and do a very costly operation on that, or like you re-render a very big component, then it might be better to split it into three parts instead of having one computed with an object to return, just so it's easier to detect, hey, can we reuse the component? Do we have to re-render that? What do we have to update in terms of props? So I think also there, then it's easier to like just fully split it up, or say you have some kind of Boolean logic you want to do in the computed right away, and then we just return true or false and have computeds for properties separately. But nevertheless, this is like really more of an edge case as a lot of things with performance in here.
Over time, the computed has gotten a lot better in like how it calculates things. I remember a few years ago, there were some edge cases that were being talked about where in certain cases, it wouldn't actually be cached properly and would trigger extra. And like in recent update, we had like even more fixes to memoize things better and all of that. And so the framework itself is improving for us. And so I think that's always really nice.
Yeah, also, as we mentioned in the 2.5 episode, like there are performance improvements just coming to us, be it like less memory consumption, as you said, like avoiding recomputing, and all the contributions there are super valuable because they're basically like there's zero cost for us. As long as everything works and thanks to the test suite, that's the case, then yeah, we're gladful for taking them. And all the people that really dig into that, because it's so different writing an application with a framework like Vue or Nuxt than actually working on the thing, like also on, let's say, compiler level or in a type level or just in the implementation. So once again, like kudos to the people that really dig into that. And like you learn so much by going through that. Like you do, for example, with your newest upcoming project.
Yeah, so recently I launched a free email course called Reactivity from Scratch, where we go through day by day for a week and we build a Vue 3 inspired composition API like reactivity system. And so we end up building actually quite a number of things. We build ref and reactive and watch and computed. And then we end up building our own sort of like Pina data store thing at the very end. We have all these things in there, read only, that kind of stuff. And it's pretty great. We've had a bunch of people sign up for it and go through it, and I've been getting some pretty good feedback from that.
So that's it. If you want to link to the landing page, go for it, because it's so nice to get into the internals, even beyond what we discussed in the podcast. Because of course, if you like do it yourself, like okay, that's how like the basics works. Even if of course the code is not one by one what's in Vue.js, but the idea, the concept, that's what you're interested in.
Yeah, there are so many edge cases and performance optimizations that are not covered in there, because then I would just be banking my own framework at that point. So
yeah. Michael's Vue.
Yeah, maybe I should do that.
I mean, would be fun. Though, like all in all, it's I think also that the big power of open source, of like all these people watching, it's like, hey, we can do better, and even the benchmarks, which we also discuss on later about performance. Like every time there's a new benchmark coming up, it's always like, yeah, is it really meaningful? We'll also see, but it will definitely point like to the authors of the frameworks, like, hey, okay, you can do better. Like, hey, someone, oh, we want to be number one. Oh, we want to be the fastest framework. And I mean, there's this super big collection, the JavaScript framework benchmark out there by Stefan Krause, who's comparing like all the frameworks out there with like the same test in terms of rendering, and that's also worth checking, of course, because yeah, performance of frameworks just on a baseline is important. Doesn't matter if it's like a millisecond more or less. Most likely not for your application, but it's good that you know how to fine tune it if you need that, for example, database and other things.
Our next topic is on virtualization, which is basically we're reusing components over and over again. So imagine if you're building like a spreadsheet app with Vue and you've got a component for every single cell. You know, if you have a 1000 by 1000 spreadsheet, that's a million components that you're working with, and that's a lot. And you're not going to render all of that all at once. And most of the time, those cells are not even on the screen. And so the idea is that you basically render what's on the screen. And then as you scroll around in the app, you deactivate the existing, like the ones that go off the screen, and reuse those. So you're not constantly creating and destroying components. You're just like reusing the existing components, and you save a lot on performance and memory as well. And it's a whole thing. And there are libraries out there. I haven't actually looked at this in a while, but years ago, at least, there were some good libraries on doing this. I'm sure there are some good ones out there still today.
Yeah, Vue Virtual Scroller from Guillaume Chow, aka Acrium, is still, I think, the most popular one for like virtual lists and things.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
That's still a good choice. With virtualization, the other part, as you mentioned, like components, that's a very good point. But also if you go a lower level, like DOM nodes just in the browser,
right?
So you don't render not only these like 1000 by 1000 components, but each of the cell will be also a DOM node, probably also with some contents on. So yeah, you especially working with like large data tables and like, as we said before, typical like CRUD application, you don't really want to render all of them at once, because especially on the, let's say, not higher end MacBook Pro and whatsoever laptops, that should still be usable. So it's good to have the data there. Of course, you have also pagination stuff, but sometimes like, okay, I want to see the last 10,000 entries. You still don't have to render them. You can search for them if you only have the data and don't need to render the DOM nodes. And yeah, as you said, with like some list virtualization, that's a good way to go. Of course, there are also some caveats there with like, okay, yeah, you want to reuse them. You have to show the scroll bar in the right height, for example. There are a few things that the libraries will really do the heavy lifting for us. But yeah, luckily they're there.
It's like a tricky implementation, because you're like if you're scrolling, you can't just render something as soon as it becomes visible, because if you do that, then the lag will mean that, you know, if you're scrolling really fast through this list, the thing will only be rendered, you know, by the time it's like already halfway up the screen. And so you have to like figure out at what point, like, is it as it's about to come into view, you need to start rendering it, and all these like things, and calculating window heights and all of that kind of stuff, which is always a fun thing to get into.
Exactly. And of course, we didn't even talk about server-side rendering to make sure all the content is there for SEO, because that's usually another topic. But yeah, that's also something to consider, where to use the virtualization and if that fits for your use case or not.
The next API we have is back to the Vue core, which is the shallowRef composable. Basically, what this one does is, normally our reactive data is reactive, and like nested properties, if you change them, will cause updates in your application. But if you have this massive object that you've got, and you know, you're changing lots of things on it, and these re-renders are expensive and slow, you can actually put it through the shallowRef, and it will only update and trigger that re-render when the entire object is replaced. But you also get a little bit of control here. There's some methods to trigger these updates manually. So if you update this object, you do something with it, and you know that you want to re-render because of that, then you can manually trigger that update. And so you have a little bit more fine-grained control over when your app is getting re-rendered, instead of just every single time, one of these like properties is updated, which could be a lot depending on how your app is working. And so you can control it and update only when you need it.
Exactly. And typical use cases, we also mentioned it before in quite some episodes, is like data fetching. Because if you fetch data, okay, then you replace the results from before. Or maybe there is no results, so they get in, that's that. And then you can, from there, reuse it, but you rarely manipulate the original ones. Maybe you have a computer property based on the data and so on and so on. And the other thing is integrating some kind of third-party state management, like immer.js, something with immutability. Because there you also, okay, you get a new state, you want to set that, you get a new state, you want to set that. You never like modify things directly. But yeah, I think these are the two most common cases. In your application, of course, if you have a scenario that like fits into one of these two and is not covered by third-party composables or APIs, like use JSON data, use fetch, they already can use shallowRef under the hood with a flag or in Nuxt 4. And of course, VueViews is also doing that. Vue query based on 10-stack query is also doing that now with a flag, I think, by latest PR. I once sent one to change it for one of the methods, but now it's available everywhere with a flag, if I remember correctly. Also, we'll link all that in description/show notes. So yeah, luckily most libraries got you covered. But if you have a case on your own, definitely, if you say, okay, I have a ref and I only replace the value, I never change it directly, might be worth moving it to shallowRef and see if it changed something or not. Yeah, and then I think like Vue specific cases, these are a good number of them. I think one more to add is maybe the classic. If you have a list of things like rendering with v4, you can memorize it as we mentioned before, but also you should set a key, right, to make sure for all these elements that right, great, they can be easily sorted, moved around by identifying key, and that key should not be the array index. That key should be part of the thing you render. Let's say you have an ID from your database or a unique combination of values whatsoever. But yeah, please don't set it to a random value. Please don't set it to the array index, because then if you start like resorting, shuffling things, stuff will break, we promise.
Yeah, I can't move on without mentioning the vapor mode, which will be coming in the future. It's being actively worked on. And this one is opt-in per component. And I believe that there aren't any like syntax changes. It's just like a switch that you can flip. And instead of using the virtual DOM, it will like directly render, and it's got some performance optimizations there. So it's like more bare metal rendering. And so that's something to look forward to in the future.
100%. And on that note, we also picked it up here and there already. There is from Vue community member Ubuge, I hope I pronounced the name the right way. He wrote a little documentation about reading Vue.js core Vapor, and he dives into the code. So not only what Vapor does, but actually the code, how things are written. So maybe if you want some understanding what's going on under the hood, how is Vapor mode differently, then yeah, definitely check that out. Also the link down there, really worth reading, and still work in progress here and there, but it's amazing. I got into it and it helps a lot to understand the code and what's written there, because as mentioned before, we're almost working on rendering engines every day.
We can't talk about Vue and performance without talking about SSR, because that is one of the benefits of SSR is we can get some extra boosts there. So there was this benchmark that came out recently, and I didn't really pay attention much to this, but you've been tracking with it a bit. So maybe you can explain a bit what happened there. And there's a little bit of drama around that. And,
tiny bit.
I mean, as with any benchmarks, there's always going to be drama. So
that's true. Yeah. So actually, there was as you said, Michael, there was a benchmark around server-side rendering. If you don't know what server-side rendering is on that point, by the way, if you never heard of the term, our very first episode after the trailer, we talked about what SSR is, the need for it, and so on, so on. So there was a benchmark of all the major frameworks like React, Solid, Svelte, Vue. Angular was even PR'd, but didn't make it eventually, Preact, and so on, based on Fastify, which is like let's say, Express-like JavaScript framework for just like running your Node.js things. So Fastify was used as the base, and then there was Fastify HTML just like as a baseline. So like, okay, I output something, and then the different frameworks like Vue, React, and so on, so on, they were used there. And the goal was, okay, we want to find out the performance of server-side rendering. So which framework can render on the server the fastest by, let's say, a constant amount of users and requests, and see like, okay, what's the best throughput? Or the other way around, I want to have X concurrent users, how many requests per second can I do? How much data is transmitted, and so on, so on. There were two iterations on the benchmark, actually. The first one was taken offline real quickly, mainly because there were some, problems with most of the implementation. So Rich Harris from Svelte pointed out that there were some issues. For example, he also contributed to the Svelte 5 version, just to like, hey, okay, things will be way better than with the current one. And there were some unnecessary style bindings. Ryan Carniato from Solid also pointed things out. Someone from the Vue community as well, Sleeby, it was the name, I think, also sent a PR to make it more fair to use the same way of styling as in other frameworks. So there were quite a few things. And I think the biggest one, then Abramov sent a PR to ensure React is also running in production and not in dev mode. So of course this changes the perspective. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that these numbers were like fixed after a week. And also to everyone making a benchmark, very important. And I also mentioned it in the video that I made about exactly the topic. Always check in with the authors, give them some time to take a look. It's like, hey, I want to publish this in a week. Take a look. Here's the code. Run it yourself. These are our results. Does that make sense? Is that the way you would write code in your framework? Also very important. It shouldn't be optimized for the benchmark. It should be as people write code.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the results were basically, to summarize, so Vue was the fastest for SSR, followed closely by Svelte and then Solid, and React was about twice as slow as Vue, and it came in at the very end there. So that's a win for Vue if you want to frame it in that way. And the question then is, what does this benchmark actually test, and does this mean anything for us developing apps, not developing benchmarks? We don't get paid to make benchmarks that are faster than other benchmarks. We get paid to build features and apps that real people are using in real ways.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair question, because first, every benchmark is always flawed. In this case, the idea was to render a little spiral out of diffs. So there was an algorithm to render a little, let's say, galaxy-like spiral with lots of elements. And that makes sense because it's very common. Okay, you have lots of DOM nodes in typical pages, but it's still not a like real life case. It's not an e-commerce page. It's not a blog or something like that. In my thesis that I still didn't publish yet, but I will at some point, I promise. I did actually investigate meta frameworks, so mainly Next and Nuxt, and also added Angular because there was no like 1.0 of analog back then, and compared these frameworks, like how they do in terms of server-side rendering. So I have a little bit of expertise in that area, and it's very interesting because in the platformatic SSR Showdown benchmark, well, first the underlying frameworks were compared, and it's a bit easier for sure. It's not a real life scenario, and especially it's good that it focuses on the framework itself. But in an actual application, okay, you like Vue without anything, just rendering the DOM nodes gets like 1,000, I don't know, something requests per second, which is pretty decent. But as soon as you add one API call to it, that will slow down dramatically, mainly because the API call is not a bottleneck, and that's very commonly the case.
Yeah.
Also for non-SSR. So as soon as you have an API involved, that's usually what slows your application down and not how fast it renders, except for data visualization. That's always a bit of an outlier.
Yeah, that's a really important point, in that the things we've been talking about today have mostly been about rendering. And once you've got all the data and you are now ready to render it out to the page, how can you make that faster? But in many cases, the actual bottleneck is, oh, you fetched twice when you only needed to fetch once, or you fetched more data than you actually needed to, or you should have cached that fetch. And there's all these other things that are like, if you look at your performance and you do like an actual like in-depth audit and stuff, you'll find that like the actual render and the especially on like initial page loads, is mostly about like fetching that data. And even like when you click a button, usually when you click a button, it causes some sort of API call to happen. Not all the time, but the speed at which that happens, and then you can update the UI is bottlenecked by that. And you can do optimistic UI updates where you assume that the request will be fine and you update the UI, and then if it fails, you can like backtrack and undo it. But yeah, it's really about the network in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And I mean, you touched already an important topic as well, the whole like big category of perceived performance, because depending, like, let's say, okay, you have a loading state while that API request, which is super slow, flies in. Well, first, easier would be like, okay, let's talk to the backend people, or like if it's your API, then make it faster. As you mentioned caching. There are lots of ways depending on the data that you get. But if you can't, for whatever reason, and it's not cacheable because it needs real time, then yeah, make sure that the loading state is there and that it's also fitting with the average expected loading time. For example, skeleton loaders, super common. It's like, okay, the page it's moving, something is happening. That's great. But for example, if the loading time is rather slow, then a skeleton loader can actually feel slower than the loading process is. So also they are looking into the perceived performance topic is super important. Not necessarily for SSR, but like in general for like transitions and states.
One interesting thing about the perceived performance that I learned a long time ago, which has always fascinated me, is that I think it's like under 200 or 300 milliseconds, you actually don't want to display any loading thing, because if it loads within 200 milliseconds, then it still feels fast. But if you flash a loading spinner in those 200 milliseconds, then it sort of feels more janky and like things are taking longer. So it's like this, it can be fairly complex of like, okay, if it's taking longer than 200 milliseconds, now we show the spinner, but don't show the loading skeletons if it's going to be too long, and all these little tricks that you can do to make it feel like it's loading faster.
Yeah, but also I think there are lots of optimizations that are always possible. I think at some time you should also like stop on us. This is like, hey, I need to bring up conversions. We have to take a look at all that, which is totally fine. But like having a loading state, unless it's super fast, right, which most of the APIs aren't, is already a good thing. And then, as you said, like going for, okay, maybe add a promise raise and say, okay, if the promise is there already, then don't show the loading state. Otherwise, all right, fine, let's go for that. So there are lots of ways to improve. Cycling back on the SSR topic, though, also there, as you mentioned, like the backend, the API is the way to go to improve. Also for SSR, for time to first byte, it's like more the general parts. We might go in another episode if you all are interested in a general performance episode. So it's really mostly about the network and then applying all the techniques that we mentioned, because the rendering, sure, if you have like 10,000 DOM nodes, you might also think about, do I really need all of this on the server? Is there something that I can render on the client? Probably there is. You might not need a modal rendered on the server, especially if it's hidden anyway, and all that. But yeah, that's also from my experience commonly tackling the API parts first, and then also seeing what can be improved. Or, as we mentioned before, like components, abstractions around that, improving the scenarios there. If you don't render a DOM node because you might not need it, that's also, if you use the component 100 times, for example, once per item, it's 100 elements less, and that's already a big change. So also make sure that you have a good way of abstractions, but not too many, or like too many DOM nodes for something that you could also do with, I don't know, different ways, a bit of CSS and so on.
Yeah, I think doing a whole episode on data fetching and caching and lazy loading components and all that kind of stuff, I think that could be a good episode, because there's a lot there still. And so, yeah, if that's interesting to you, let us know on Twitter or X, whatever you like to call it, in the comments. Email us, send us a letter in the mail.
Exactly.
I don't think we have any addresses publicly, but
give us a letter to conference. Talk to us. Yeah, and of course, before we fully say goodbye, we have a little discount code for the upcoming VueConf in Toronto for you. That's correct. We hopefully will be there. We don't know yet because we both applied. I think one of us might be, maybe the two of us. I will definitely let you know when the info is out. But with the code DejaVue, you save 15%. on the whole thing. So grab the tickets now. Also workshops there, for example, from the wonderful Daniel Rowe, who also joined us here. Vue will be covered through 2 days, and Evan will also be there. So definitely give that a go. Link with the coupon code down there.
Yeah, and I'll be there regardless because it's in my backyard, basically.
It's around the corner.
It's right here. So I'm there every year, and I'll be there this year as well. So if you're in the area, or even if you're not, I'd love to see you there.
Yeah, likewise. Even I might be there, might not, but definitely catch Michael. Maybe the two of us. Maybe we'll have a little DejaVue episode there. Who knows? Who knows? We will see. But where you can catch us in other DejaVue episodes, of course, the older ones, the older episodes, definitely check them out. A few we mentioned are linked down there. And if you don't watch that straight away in the first week it comes out, also the newer episodes. So have a look at all of them and let us know what you think. Until then, stay tuned and hopefully see you soon all.